Have the honor this morning of having Dr. David Timmer with us again. David gave us some excellent views and information on Bonhoeffer last year, and he's back again to talk about Christian nationalism, kind of a hot topic, but I think something we all need to be aware of and see how our Christian background applies to that. So welcome here. Please pray with me. And gracious and holy God, we thank you once again for being with us here today, for the opportunity to learn what is going on in our world, to try to seek out your guidance in how we live our lives with all of the dissent, all of the confusion, and all that goes around us. We pray that you are with us, and we seek your guidance. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen.
I will add that David comes with credentials, 40 years of teaching religious studies at Snooker College, and sort of 5 years of retirement now.
Sort of. Yeah, my voice is kind of booming here. How's it coming across to you?
It's echoey. Yeah, it's a little.
You may want to turn it down a little. Okay. Well, we'll get started and let the sound people work it out. Okay, I've got 3 weeks of these Sunday hours to talk about a subject that I think is important and relevant today, maybe as much or more than it has been in decades, if not centuries, in American life. The title that I've given to this little mini course is Christian Nationalism, a Radical Vision for America's Future. When I use the word radical, of course, I don't necessarily, that's not necessarily a bad thing. Sometimes a little radicality is needed. But I use it to emphasize the fact that Christian nationalism is a definite movement, an intentional movement. Not everyone who is adjacent to the movement might be aware of the ultimate aims of the movement, but the leadership echelons of the movement, I think, are. We can each make our own judgments about the nature of this movement and whether it corresponds to what we think that Christianity is all about, what we think the United States is all about. But I think we need full and accurate information about it. So that's my goal over the next 3 weeks. And I've got kind of a 4-part outline here. It's going to be spread over 3 weeks, so obviously we're not necessarily going to divide it up real neatly. But the first thing that I want to do is to define the term Christian nationalism. What exactly do we mean? Because there's a lot of things that one could mean. As the pastor mentioned this morning, you combine two nouns like this, use one as an adjective. Christian is an adjective, nationalism is the noun. That could mean a lot of different things. So we need to focus our attention on what exactly is meant by that term, what definition is relevant for our particular situation. And then we're going to talk historically a little bit. This is something I'm comfortable doing. I was basically trained as a historian of Christianity, so I like to look at things historically, and to try to understand the sources of Christian nationalist thought and action in America. So that's part 2. Part 3, we'll talk about strategies of Christian nationalism, that is, for people who see themselves as a part of this movement, how do they attempt to enact it, put it into action? And then finally, how should we evaluate and respond to Christian nationalism? Okay, and obviously, people may have different evaluations and different responses. I'm obviously going to propose one such, but we can certainly talk about alternatives. The first thing we're going to do is defining Christian nationalism while hopefully avoiding stereotypes. It's always easy to kind of categorize people that you might have political or cultural differences with in some kind of unattractive category, and hopefully we're not going to do that. But we do want to be accurate, and we do want to be precise. And I think it's important maybe to start out by talking about what Christian nationalism is not, because I think some people have proposed definitions of that term that in one way or another attempt to kind of make it no big deal, you might say, to kind of minimize what I would think of as the radicality of the claims that Christian nationalists are making. Marjorie Taylor Greene, for example, has proposed that Christian nationalism simply means Christians who love their nation. And she says, what could possibly be wrong with that? I'm a Christian, there's nothing wrong with that. I love my nation, wrong with that. I must be a Christian nationalist. What could be wrong with that? In my view, this is a deliberate trivialization. It's designed to obscure the controversial elements of the concept. Right? When you combine two words like that, you can't simply define it by separating the two terms and defining them separately and then saying it doesn't mean anything more than that. It's the combination that's important here. Christian nationalism also isn't just Christians who want to see their values reflected in the nation's life. Right? Who doesn't, at some level? The real issue is how to balance the desire to see your deeply held values expressed in the life of the nation on the one hand, with pluralism, religious liberty, tolerance on the other hand. Inclusivity, right? All those words that we're not supposed to say anymore, I guess.
Don't you do?
So that's kind of the key, and there have always been Christians, and hopefully we're among them, who want to see the fundamental values of our faith reflected in the life of our nation. How do you go about that? Well, I think one way to go about that is to basically define the nation as a Christian nation. And this is, I think, something that Christian nationalists pretty regularly do. They say, we should declare the United States of America to be a Christian nation. What exactly would that mean? How would that change anything? Well, one way in which it would change things is that now Christian values should have presumptive authority in society, and I kind of emphasize that word presumptive. What does it mean to have presumptive authority? It's not a word we use every day, but anybody have any ideas about what presumptive would mean in this context?
Understood. You just understand that it does.
Okay, it's kind of understood, it's baked in, right? It's presumed, right? It doesn't have to be argued, you don't have to persuade people. It's just there, it's already on the books, right? So that's one thing that it would mean. I think another thing that it would mean to, say, declare the United States to be a Christian nation is that Christian teaching would be supported by state institutions. That could occur in a lot of different ways, but public schools would be an obvious example. Okay, are we going to post the 10 Commandments in the public schools? Well, that might seem innocuous enough, but on the other hand, it might also be the first step in a process that would lead to an increasing capture of the educational system by a particular religious perspective. A third thing that it might mean, that it would mean, I think, is that Christian leaders would have privileged access to political power. By privileged access, basically that means that they have access that other people don't. Right? They've got an in. They can count on the government, on the state and its representatives to represent their point of view, to have their back, so to speak, to argue for their case and to enact their programs. Here's an interesting quote from someone who was at the time running for the Republican nomination for the presidency in 2016. And it's something that he said in Sioux Center, Iowa. Christianity will have power. If I'm there in the presidency, you're going to have plenty of power. You don't need anybody else. You're going to have somebody representing you very, very well. Remember that. Right? Remember that when you go into the voting booth. Right? I'm your friend. You will have privileged access to political power. And presumably, the result of that will be these other elements. Christian teaching will be supported by state institutions, and Christian values will have presumptive authority within society. Now, I can hear some of you asking, but David, what about the separation of church and state? Isn't that a constitutional principle? Isn't that part of the ground rules that we operate with here in the United States? Well, I think a Christian nationalist is going to say, no, those words, separation of church and state, are not in the Constitution. They're right about that. And this whole notion is a secularist myth about the Constitution and the constitutional order. Well, what exactly does that mean? Well, let's look at what the Constitution does say. These words come from the very beginning of the First Amendment to the Constitution. Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise thereof. And I give you some ellipsis dots there to indicate that it goes on to say, talk about a lot of other things, like freedom of speech and freedom of the press and freedom of assembly, freedom to petition the government for redress of grievance and so forth and so forth. But initially it says Congress shall make no law, respecting an establishment of religion or prohibiting the free exercise of. In constitutional law, these are usually called the religion clauses of the Constitution. Clause 1 is respecting an establishment of religion. Clause 2 is prohibiting the free exercise thereof. So, what do those terms mean? What, for example, is an establishment of religion? Anybody?
Church of England, maybe?
Okay, Church of England might be an example of an established religion. What is it about the Church of England that makes it fit into that category rather than, say, Methodist churches in England or Baptist churches or Hindu temples or whatever else?
The king is the head of the church.
Okay, the king is the head of the church. What else?
Could you define respecting?
What's that? Yeah, I could define it in a lot of different ways. And that's one of the issues, okay? What exactly does respecting mean? I think the Supreme Court has held pretty consistently that a law respecting an establishment of religion would certainly mean any law that established a religion, right? Any law that said the Presbyterian Church in the USA is now the official religion of the realm, and the President of the United States will function as the head of the General Assembly. And if you want to revise the liturgy, you'll have to get congressional approval. And all sorts of other things that kind of boggle our minds a little bit, but that's how things work in England. And it's not necessarily that the Church of England actually has all that much power, but it does have that kind of privileged position, but it's a privilege that works both ways. Right? It gives the government certain privileges with respect to religion, as well as giving religion certain privileges, in this case the Church of England, certain privileges with respect to the government.
So would it mean that there would be money from the state, with this, an established religion by the country, mean that federal funds or state funds would go to supporting the religious establishments?
It could mean that. I think you can find establishments of religion that differ in detail from one another, but perhaps the stronger forms of establishment would involve state financial support for religious institutions. Maybe the salaries of clergy would be paid by the state, and they would be considered civil servants. That's how things operated in most European countries. In many cases, well into the 20th century. Even after the church had lost a lot of its actual power, the structures of establishment quite often still remained intact. So, on the one hand, you have Congress shall make no law respecting an establishment of religion. On the other hand, you have the clause, Congress shall make no law prohibiting the free exercise of religion. So that takes things from the institutional level down to the individual level. Right? Congress can't make any law that basically says you can't follow a particular religion. You can't join or be a believer in a particular religion. Okay? That is outside of Congress's jurisdiction. Now you might say, well, Congress, yeah, but what about the Iowa State Legislature? It doesn't say anything about that. What about the local school board? It doesn't say anything about that, does it? And technically that's true, it doesn't. But for the last 150 years or so, since the Civil War and the passage in the wake of the Civil War of the 14th Amendment in particular, the Supreme Court has basically said, when the Constitution says Congress shall make no law, let's say restricting the freedom of speech, which it also says in the First Amendment, it really means that no government at any level in the United States can do that. Technically, the term is the rights of the so-called Bill of Rights have been incorporated to the states by a series of Supreme Court decisions. These religion clauses were among the last to be incorporated, and that process within Supreme Court decisions really only started, I think, in the 1940s, and culminated in the early 1960s in a pair of decisions concerning public schools that we'll get back to later.
David,
Yeah.
question. If we were to say that our belief in St. Andrew is that we protect the immigrant and we want to be a sanctuary hub down here and put cots in, and the government says no, we will send ICE officers into your church. Does this relate to free exercise of our religion?
Well, I suppose if you were going to defend that decision in court, then you would probably want your attorney to reference the free exercise clause and say, the government is interfering with our free exercise of religion. We're doing this out of religious conviction, and the government is restricting us from that. Now, of course, rights aren't absolute. The right of free speech isn't absolute, right? You can't yell fire in a crowded theater. Right? So there are always limitations, even to the most important rights that are spoken of in the First Amendment. So it's not a neat and tidy issue that can be determined in advance, how the Supreme Court or the courts in general are going to rule on matters like that. But the question is, how do you balance those two clauses over against each other? Because there are times, and we'll see some examples of this as we go on in this class, there are times when it seems as if, the anti-establishment clause and the free exercise clause kind of rub up against each other and create some friction. I'll just give one example that we'll come back to later on. There was a recent decision concerning a football coach who wanted to pray at the 50-yard line at the conclusion of football games. And he invited players and anybody else to join him in that. And state courts, I think in the state of Washington, ruled that he was acting in his role as an employee of the state of Washington and using the facilities of the state of Washington, and that he was, in a sense, using those facilities to advance his particular religious views. Eventually, the Supreme Court overturned that decision, and they overturned it on a free exercise basis. They said, no, he was acting as a private citizen, and the state of Washington interfered with his free exercise of his religion. So that's a case where, depending on whether you regard it as an establishment clause case or a free exercise case, you might come to different conclusions. And we'll see some other ways in which that tension kind of functions in this realm. Yeah, Paul?
My name is Phil.
Phil, sorry.
So, to my knowledge, churches do not pay taxes on what they get through donations. They don't pay taxes on the property of the church. I mean, is that true? I don't know.
Pretty much, yeah.
Okay, so that's a clear-cut separation of church and state.
Well,
Okay, now, I know it's going to be viewed as being kind of controversial, but okay, so a church declares itself a sanctuary for the new immigrants who have come to this country across the border. And I think, yes, that the church does ask for contributions to help support them. And yet, the state is going to be required to pay a lot of expenses to support the immigrants into becoming self-supporting. So, how does that work, the separation of church and state?
Yeah, excellent question. I think a lot of people, looking at the history of Supreme Court decisions, for example, regarding this issue, would say that the line separating church and state doesn't go like this. It goes like this. It's all over the place. depending on the issue and depending on the particular details involved in the issue. And the question of whether churches should be tax exempt is one of those issues. On the one hand, you could say that churches are charitable or nonprofit organizations, so they should share in the tax exemptions of other nonprofits. But the church exemption is actually broader than other nonprofits receive. And you might argue, well, the power to tax is the power to destroy, right? The government can use the power of taxation to attack a particular group or a particular product, by raising the taxes to intolerable levels. And so we don't want to give the government the power to attack religious institutions, churches, synagogues, whatever. Right? And so by making them tax exempt, we can preserve their rights to their free exercise. But on the other hand, people would say, yeah, but we're giving up tax money for the benefit of these religious organizations. So, my tax dollars, in a sense, are being spent implicitly, right, to support these religions. So, there's almost no way that the government and religious institutions can be kept totally separate from each other. They're always going to be entangled with each other. Right? The question is, how do you regulate that entanglement in a way that kind of maximizes both the non-establishment clause and the free exercise clauses and balances them against each other? Yeah, another question?
Well, I was just gonna say, I think it's arguable to say that churches being exempt from taxation is a separation of church and state. It seems like a privilege, do you know what I mean? So is that
It could be seen that way.
Is that a privilege that churches get?
Yeah, certainly insofar as it goes beyond the privileges that other tax-exempt nonprofit organizations experience. But that, again, kind of leads us into a lot of tall weeds that are really, really interesting for judges and lawyers and organizations, but that we can't necessarily resolve in this context. But I think that those very good questions illustrate the complexity of the relationship, between religious institutions, including churches, and government, that belie the apparent simplicity of those two religion clauses. But one of the issues that Christian nationalism is going to raise is, have we gone way, way, way too far in the direction of respecting that establishment clause to the point where we are really kind of violating people's free exercise? A more radical way of putting the point, which some proponents of Christian nationalism will put out there, is, look, the religion clauses were really meant only to protect churches from state power, not to protect the state from the church's power. David Barton, who's someone we'll learn a little bit more about later on, basically says it's a one-way wall. I find that a charming concept. I've never seen a one-way wall in reality, but he thinks that there is a wall separating the state from having the power to govern the church, but there is no wall separating the church from having power over the state, and there shouldn't be, according to the Constitution. I've heard of a one-way mirror, but never a one-way wall. But that means for him and for other Christian nationalists that the Supreme Court should reverse course, as it has in fact done in recent years, from its previous separationist trend. There's a long series of decisions starting in the 1940s, culminating in the school prayer and Bible reading decisions of the early 1960s, continuing after that, that seem to move in a separationist direction. there's been a more recent series of decisions, including the Kennedy versus Bremerton that I just referred to, that seem to kind of reverse course and move back in the other direction. And in one sense, that's what you have to expect in a complicated field of law like this, right? You're never going to be able to come up with a simple, clear solution that satisfies everybody for all time. And it's always going to be under negotiation to a certain extent. But should we go so far as to expect the Supreme Court to uphold laws and practices that actively favor and fund Christian causes? Well, Christian nationalists will say yes. We should go that far. Even farther than that, perhaps, in other areas. But that's certainly how the Supreme Court might factor into the policies that they would recommend. Now, the question you always have to ask is, what do we mean by Christianity? If we talk about the United States as a Christian nation, whose Christianity counts? Because Christianity is itself a pretty diverse phenomenon. In the United States, in the world as a whole, in history, it's meant a lot of different things to a lot of different people. Which Christianity are we talking about? Well, for most of the people who today advocate for Christian nationalism, the Christianity in question is going to be conservative. It's going to be conservative doctrinally, and it's going to be conservative politically. Okay? Their argument will be, when we say that Christianity should be, in a sense, the official religion of the United States, we're not talking about those, those liberals in the United Church of Christ or the PCUSA or whatever. We're talking about real Christians, Bible-believing Christians. And from their perspective, I suppose that's a fair point to note that Christianity is diverse, and so you really need to figure out what you mean by that term. So, conservative theologically and politically, more specifically, you'll find, I think, a lot of talk about traditional family values, so conservative culturally as well. Traditional family values meaning the way things were done in the United States previous to, let's say, the 1960s, 70s, and 80s, previous to the sexual revolution, to second wave feminism, for some, to the civil rights movement, right? There's a lot of things that have happened, some of which may be good, but most of which are felt to be questionable from a cultural point of view. And so there's a desire to kind of turn back the clock on some of those issues and go back to the way things were at an earlier period. I won't say make America great again, but that might be one way of putting it. So, as you might guess, when Christian nationalism comes from a Protestant perspective, the form of Protestantism involved would be evangelical Protestant rather than what we sometimes call mainline or liberal Protestantism. Now, how exactly you define that difference, that can vary. But I think most of these proponents would say, whatever the details, Christianity represents a tradition-anchored perspective that will be conservative with respect to lots of the social and cultural changes that we have experienced, say, over the last 50 or 60 years. Now, there's also a Roman Catholic version of Christian nationalism, sometimes referred to within Catholicism as integralism. An integer in mathematics is a whole number, right? And so integralism means that reality as a whole should be unified, and that means that the religious and the political should be unified. Within Catholicism, of course, there's a fairly long history of Christendom, that is to say, of situations where church and state were very closely allied and united with each other, as there is within Protestantism as well, but of course Catholicism can trace its roots back into the Middle Ages. This tends to be maybe a somewhat more intellectual version of Christian nationalism. Some of the primary intellectual representatives would be Adrian Vermeule, who's a very interesting professor at Harvard Law School, who's proposed what he calls common good constitutionalism, which basically means that the government should be able to legislate values much more aggressively than we perhaps have been comfortable with in recent decades, and that those values can and should come from the religious tradition of the populace, and in his case in particular from the church. Patrick Deneen, political scientist from Notre Dame, is another proponent of this. And one of his recent books is entitled Regime Change Toward a Post-Liberal Future. And that whole idea of regime change, I think he's asking for that to be taken quite seriously. We've had one regime governing us under Republicans and Democrats for decades. That needs to change. So he's talking about a fairly radical change. One individual who has articulated a lot of those ideas and who has a lot of associations with people like Vermeule and Deneen is J.D. Vance, the vice president. He's a recent convert to Catholicism, and his conversion was very much under the influence of people who are attached to this Catholic integralist movement. We're not going to talk a lot about integralism. It's a fascinating subject in itself. I could do another 3 weeks on that if I did some research. We're going to primarily focus on Protestant and evangelical Protestant, particularly proponents of Christian nationalism. But we should just be aware that this other alternative is out there as well. Now, where do these ideas come from within American history and within the political and social development of the United States? So this is our second major section, Sources of Christian Nationalist Thought and Action, 1975 to the present. Whenever you're giving a historical presentation, the first thing you have to decide is, what's my starting point going to be? Could go back to 1776, or maybe 1791, right? The constitutional founding. Could go back to 1517, the Reformation. I could go back to, 310, Constantine. Could go back farther than that. Wherever you go back to, you could have gone back farther, right? That's been my experience in 41 years of teaching the history of anything, right? Wherever you decide to start, you could have started earlier, because reality didn't suddenly spring into existence in 1975. I like that date, though. It kind of, it's my adult life. I got married. Mary and I got married in 1975, so it was 50th anniversary year this year, and so that's a span of history that I have experienced, you might say. I've been kind of watching these issues for half a century now. And so I think maybe I can say something in particular about that history. we'll be doing some deeper dives into the deeper past as we go along. But our main focus is going to be on how things have developed in the United States over the last 50 years or so. And if you go back to 1975, we're talking about something that historians, American historians, and particularly American religious historians, would call the era of the evangelical resurgence. It's a long period of time, maybe stretching to 50 years before this, from the mid-1920s to the mid-1970s, where much of evangelical Christianity was, from a political point of view, and maybe from a social point of view too, somewhat inwardly focused. You can talk about some of the reasons for that. Conservatives and evangelicals lost a series of battles in the 1920s, either politically or culturally or sometimes denominationally, that kind of made them outsiders. And they tended to adopt a theology that justified that outsider status, that basically said, the world is going to heck in a handbasket and we can't do much about it, so what we need to do is to make sure that our communities are, our religious communities are vital and growing. We convert people into those communities, but we don't necessarily get involved in politics, because that's a dirty business and it's not really going to do any good anyway. But during the 1970s, you get a series of developments that begins to bring a lot of conservative, evangelical, in some cases fundamentalist Protestant Christians out of that passivity and inward focus. And they start looking out to the broader culture and saying, we need to be involved and engaged and we can make a difference. These probably aren't household names to a lot of people, Paul Weyrich and Richard Viguerie, but they are very important historical figures in this regard. They're kind of founders of a new brand of conservatism, what back in the 1970s would have been called the New Right. And they would contrast themselves and their New Right cohorts with what they would call rather derisively Rockefeller Republicans. Okay, Republicans whose version of conservative politics was more like Nelson Rockefeller's. Elitist, kind of intellectual, culturally somewhat liberal, maybe fiscally conservative, but that didn't really satisfy these New Right activists. Today you might hear people use the term rhino, Republican in name only. They're basically fighting the same battle, in a sense, saying the establishment Republicans really aren't fighting hard enough for the issues that matter to us, particularly the cultural issues that matter to us. And so a lot of people began to coalesce within this movement. Some examples would be Phyllis Schlafly and the Eagle Forum, that was mainly concerned with opposition to the Equal Rights Amendment and to modern feminism, right? Once again, wanted to hark back to an earlier age, you might say, where family structures were more defined and more in accordance with their religious convictions. Jerry Falwell and the Moral Majority emerges during this period between 1975 and 1980. Jerry Falwell is one of those fundamentalist pastors who early in his career said Christians should not get involved in politics, but all of a sudden in the mid-1970s he's saying Christians should get involved in politics, right? He represents something that I call here public-facing premillennial dispensationalism. We could spend a long time unpacking that phrase. We don't have a long time, so we're not going to do that, but I'll just say that premillennial dispensationalism, I kind of alluded to that a little while ago when I talked about a point of view that basically is pessimistic about history and doesn't think that Christians can change anything. We already know from the book of Revelation that the Great Tribulation is on the way, and the rapture and all the rest of it, and there's nothing really that we can do to derail that or to make that any better, and so we just have to hunker down and make sure that we preserve our own holiness and so forth and so forth. And all of a sudden, Jerry Falwell is giving a different message. He's saying, now I think the United States plays a special role in God's end time plans. And that justifies us in trying to make sure that the United States is worthy of that role. And that means that we have to get involved in politics and in cultural issues and stop the slide, as he saw it, right? The slide into anarchy and chaos and so forth. And when he decides to call his organization the moral majority, he's basically saying, we think that most people in our society are in our corner, are on our side. And so we're going to try to create a political coalition that is going to be led by evangelical Christians, but that's going to include other people as well. And so he starts reaching out to Catholics and Jews, right? And other folks within society that he thinks will resonate with the issues that he's elevating. That in itself is a very interesting thing for fundamentalists to do, because the fundamentalism that emerged in America after the 1920s tended to be, again, very reserved, particularly about cooperating with anybody who disagreed with you theologically. And now Falwell is saying, okay, just forget that. We need allies. And anybody who can sign on the dotted line for the issues that we're supporting is on our side. Another example would be Pat Robertson, and his organization was called the Christian Coalition. Once again, very adept naming strategy. The Christian Coalition implies that people who aren't a part of this coalition either aren't Christians or are some inferior brand of Christian, right? We're the ones who represent Christianity, Pat Robertson would say. Now, Robertson didn't have the burden that Jerry Falwell had. Falwell had to deal with this premillennial dispensationalist eschatology that didn't seem to offer much justification for political activism. Pat Robertson was not a dispensationalist. And so he begins to come up with a theology that talks about Christians achieving the kind of millennial level of society before the return of Christ. And in order to do that, Christians will need to seek to have dominion within society. So that word dominion is a word we're going to encounter frequently. And Pat Robertson is one of the early people to pick up on that term and say that should be a goal of Christians, to dominate within society and to preserve society, once again, from the decay and decline that he saw our society as suffering from. It's not an accident that in 1988, some of you are old enough to remember it like me, Pat Robertson tossed his hat in the ring for the Republican nomination for president. And in the Iowa caucuses, did quite well, right? And so for a few weeks, people were imagining that he might actually win the nomination and run for president on the Republican ticket. New Hampshire kind of put an end to that. That's a different voting environment, and he didn't do well there, and after that it was kind of downhill. But it's not accidental that he went beyond creating an organization to represent certain values and policy choices, but he ran for political office himself. If we fast forward to 1990 or so, then we see a kind of second generation emerging within this evangelical resurgence. One example of that would be James Dobson and his focus on the family organization. Dobson starts out as a kind of a child psychologist who offers advice on parenting. But eventually he decides that the problem is not so much that parents don't know how to raise their kids, it's that society is working against them. Developments in society need to be changed so that the family structure can be reestablished on a sound basis. So he morphs from a family psychologist to being something of a culture warrior, and his focus on the family organization becomes an organization that takes very definite political positions on all sorts of issues that are relevant to culture. Ralph Reed and the Faith and Freedom Coalition is another example of this kind of second generation of the evangelical resurgence. Reed is really someone who was able to mold a very effective political strategy for organizations, for this people with who wanted to see a greater influence of traditional values, traditional family values within society. Jerry Falwell and Pat Robertson, even James Dobson, they were not political operatives. And so when you start asking questions like, which issue should we tackle first? And how should we express ourselves on this issue in the most persuasive way? And what level should we work at? Are we going to focus on national politics, or are we going to focus on state politics? We're going to focus on local politics. How are we going to apportion our energy, between those different levels? Ralph Reed was kind of a brilliant political strategist in that sense, and he begins to shape an effective political strategy. Now, you could ask the question, and as I was observing this process, I was certainly asking the question, was this just a new citizen mobilization effort within American civil society? Because if it is, you might say, look, these people have as much right to organize around their issues as any of us have to organize around our issues. Even if I don't agree with them, that's what democracy is all about, right? And I tended to be a little pushed out of shape when people said, Christians should not be involved in politics, right? Because that violates the separation of church and state. I said, wait a minute, I'm a Christian. I'm involved in politics. I don't agree with these people on a lot of issues, but I got to defend their right to organize and to, advocate for their point of view. So if that's what we're looking at here, then maybe there's nothing really problematic or objectionable about it. I include Ted Peters' name there. Ted Peters is a theologian who is what I would call a Christian nationalism denier. He would call me a Christian nationalist alarmist. Kind of the same as in climate science. You have, one side calls the other side deniers or alarmists, whatever the most effective rhetorical strategy is. But Ted Peters would say, look, I never run into any people that I could really call Christian nationalists. And then he acknowledges, yeah, of course I live in Berkeley, California, and hang around with a bunch of liberals, so, maybe it's not surprising I never run into these people. But he does make the argument that, we have to protect people's right to organize politically around issues that are important to them. That's part of what it means to live in a pluralistic American democracy. And I'd agree with him there. But I've come to the conclusion over the last few years that we're really looking at something that goes beyond that. Were there more radical elements stirring under the surface? I've begun to think that there are. Now, how are we doing for time? We're just about out of time for today. But starting next week, I want to look at several different movements, you could call them, bodies of ideas and organizations to advocate for those ideas and organize political action around them. The first is going to be the Christian Reconstructionist or Theonomist movement, but there's going to be at least 3 others as well. And we're going to look at how they began to develop and articulate ideas and strategies that went beyond simply saying we have the right to organize just like anybody else does. And that in fact began to say the purpose of our organizing and our political action should be to, in a sense, take control of society and its basic institutions. And where the dividing line is between those two things is not always clear, right? There's always going to be a gray area there. But my contention will be that some of these movements cross that line in a pretty clear way, and we're seeing the impact of that today. So I think, it's 11:45, so if you've got more questions, I love the questions that we've had so far, but if you've got more, you can talk to me afterward or save the question and ask it next week. I hope to see you all back here next week.
Thank you, David.